The sun was just beginning to set behind the Montana hills, spilling gold across the endless fields of tall grass. Sarah stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing off dinner plates, when she noticed something odd through the window. Movement, slow, heavy. She squinted against the fading light. At first, she thought it was a large stray dog. Then she saw the silhouette, the unmistakable curve of a powerful shoulder, the graceful, deadly gait, a lioness. Sarah froze, heart thundering in her chest. "Jack!" she hissed. Her husband appeared from the living room, still wiping grease from his hands after fixing the generator. Before either of them could react, there was a soft, almost hesitant thud against the front porch. Sarah peered through the peephole. What she saw made her heart twist. The lioness stood right at their door. At her side, barely standing, was a small, trembling cub. The cub's front leg hung awkwardly, clearly broken. Blood matted his golden fur. And the mother? She wasn't snarling. She wasn't threatening. She was waiting. Sarah and Jack exchanged a look, equal parts fear and disbelief. Their young son, Ethan, tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "Mom, she needs help," he said softly. Sarah's hands shook. Logic screamed to stay inside, to lock the doors, to call wildlife services and wait. But her heart, the ancient wild part of her, whispered something different. "Open the door." Outside, the lioness shifted her weight anxiously, her golden eyes pleading without a sound. Sarah reached for the doorknob, and the world held its breath. Sarah's hand hovered over the doorknob. Jack stood behind her, tense, holding Ethan close with one arm. No one said a word. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. Finally, with a deep, steadying inhale, Sarah turned the knob and eased the door open. Just a crack, enough to meet those eyes. The lioness lowered her head slightly, a gesture that didn't feel threatening. It felt pleading. Sarah opened the door wider, her movements slow and deliberate. The cub whimpered weakly, swaying where he stood. Jack whispered hoarsely, "Sarah, what are you doing?" But even he didn't stop her. Some things were bigger than fear. Sarah knelt just inside the doorway, reaching out a hand, palm up, fingers relaxed. The lioness watched every twitch, every breath. Then, as if understanding, she nudged the cub forward gently with her massive head. The little one stumbled toward Sarah, collapsing at the threshold. Sarah's heart shattered at the sight. She moved closer, inch by inch, until her fingertips brushed the cub's fur. Hot, sticky, broken. The lioness let out a low, rumbling chuff. Not a warning, but an encouragement. Sarah looked back at Jack. He nodded once, stiffly. Together, they scooped up the cub, careful not to jostle his injured leg. As they backed slowly into the house, the lioness remained at the threshold. She didn't try to follow. She just sat, silent, steady, waiting, trusting. And as Sarah and Jack carried the cub toward the living room, Ethan whispered in awe, "She brought him to us because she knew." Because somehow, across the vast, brutal line between wild and human, the lioness had chosen to trust. Jack cleared off the dining table in seconds, sending homework sheets and cereal boxes flying. Sarah gently laid the cub down, careful not to jostle his injured leg. The little lion whimpered once, then went still. Ethan hovered nearby, wide-eyed but silent, clutching his stuffed bear. Jack grabbed the first aid kit from under the sink. It wasn't meant for lions. It barely handled Ethan's scraped knees, but it would have to do. Sarah's hands moved with surprising calm. She cleaned the cub's wounds with warm water and antiseptic, murmuring soft nonsense words, the way she had when Ethan was a baby. The cub whimpered again, but didn't pull away. Outside, Through the open door, the lioness waited. Every so often, she let out a low, throaty chuff, a sound that seemed to say, "Is he safe?" Sarah worked quickly but gently. The broken leg was bad, swollen at an awkward angle. Jack fashioned a splint from wooden spoons and strips of an old bedsheet. When they finally wrapped the leg, the cub sighed heavily, as if the worst pain had finally eased. Sarah brushed a hand over his tiny, battered body, her voice breaking. "He's just a baby." Jack stood back, surveying their makeshift work. "It's not perfect," he said, "but it's hope." They placed the cub on a thick, folded blanket near the fireplace. Ethan knelt beside him, carefully offering a shallow bowl of water. The cub lifted his head slightly and lapped weakly at the water. Sarah exhaled a shaky laugh. "That's it, little guy. Fight." And outside, the great lioness let out a sound that wasn't a roar, but something almost like relief. By dawn, the cub was breathing easier. His small chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, the feverish tremble gone from his body. Sarah dozed in a chair beside him, one hand resting gently on the cub's back. Jack brewed coffee in the kitchen, glancing out the window every few minutes. The lioness was still there. She hadn't moved all night. She sat like a sentry, a stone figure carved by the gods, watching, waiting, hoping. When the first light of morning spilled over the hills, the cub stirred. He lifted his head and gave a soft, rasping mewl. Sarah bolted awake, heart racing. The cub tried to stand, wobbled, but managed a few shaky steps. Jack knelt, holding his breath. "He's strong," he whispered. "A fighter." Ethan pressed his face against the window and gasped. "Mom, Dad, she's coming." Sarah turned just in time to see the lioness rise to her full, magnificent height. Slowly, gracefully, she approached the porch. Sarah opened the door again, heart pounding for reasons she didn't fully understand. The lioness stopped a few feet away, golden eyes locked on Sarah's. For a long, charged moment, they simply stared at each other. Then the cub limped forward, guided by an invisible pull stronger than pain. He crossed the threshold, out of the house, back into the wild. The lioness leaned down and gently nuzzled her cub, snuffling his fur, licking the top of his head. Then she looked back at Sarah one last time. And in that gaze, there was no threat, only gratitude, only something ancient and pure, etched deeper than words. A silent goodbye, a promise kept, a bridge built, without a single roar, without a single sound. The story spread faster than wildfire. Sarah didn't post about it. Jack didn't call the local news. But somehow, word traveled. First, it was the neighbors. A few ranchers who noticed paw prints near their fences and asked why they looked like they'd come to visit, not to hunt. Then the local vet, who came to check on Sarah's makeshift splint, shared the story with a friend in the conservation department. A few days later, a wildlife photographer caught sight of the lioness and her limping cub, stronger now, thriving, and snapped a picture. He captioned it simply, "Saved by kindness." Within a week, the story went viral. News outlets scrambled to cover it. Not a tale of fear, not of conflict, but of a family who had seen a wild creature in need and chose to open their door instead of locking it. The photos of Sarah kneeling at her porch, arms outstretched to a battered cub, circulated around the globe. Children wrote letters to wildlife organizations, asking how they could help. Artists painted murals of lions and humans standing side by side. A group of conservationists founded a new initiative, Friends of the Wild. It wasn't about taming animals. It wasn't about rescuing them from their nature. It was about meeting them at the threshold, respecting their world, while protecting ours. Jack built a small wooden plaque they hung above their front door. We chose to open the door. And every time Sarah passed beneath it, she smiled. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to say yes to the wild. Months slipped by. The lioness and her cub melted back into the vast golden wilderness, leaving only paw prints and memories behind. Life on the ranch returned to its steady rhythm. Ethan grew taller. Jack repaired more fences. Sarah planted wildflowers along the driveway. But some nights, when the stars blanketed the sky so thick, it felt like you could scoop them into your hands. Sarah would stand on the porch, coffee cooling in her mug, eyes scanning the distant tree line, waiting, hoping. One night, when the moon was a thin silver smile, Ethan burst through the door, barefoot and breathless. "Mom, Dad, look." Sarah and Jack followed him outside, hearts pounding. There, just beyond the fence, stood two figures. The lioness, and beside her, no longer a cub, but a strong young male. He stood tall and proud, his coat gleaming in the moonlight. They didn't approach the house this time. They didn't need to. They simply stood there, silhouetted against the stars, watching, acknowledging, thanking. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Jack slipped an arm around her shoulders, pulling Ethan close. And under the ancient whispering sky, the family and the wild stood together once more. No doors needed opening now. The bridge had been built. The trust had been sealed. And as the lions turned and melted back into the night, Sarah whispered into the cool air, "We'll always be here." And somewhere across the endless fields, a soft, rolling chuff answered back, carried by the wind, carried by memory, carried by something wilder, stronger, and more eternal than words could ever hold.
If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Subscribe for more inspiring stories.